When paramedics found the charred remains in the BMW, dental records confirmed it. Elena Vasquez was dead. Except Elena was very much alive, working as a nurse 3 states away, while somewhere, a family was still searching for their missing daughter, whose body had taken Elena's place. If cases like this fascinate you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because trust me, this story gets darker with every detail we uncover. And don't forget to join our community by clicking that join button for exclusive behind-the-scenes content. But let's go back to where it all began. David Kim had always believed in the reliability of routine. Every morning at 6:15, he would start the coffee maker in their modest kitchen in San Antonio's northwest side. By 6:30, Elena would emerge from their bedroom, hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing the navy blue scrubs that had become as much a part of her identity as her infectious laugh. They had built their American dream methodically, brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck. David worked as a software engineer at a mid-sized tech company downtown, while Elena spent her days caring for patients at Methodist Hospital's cardiac unit. To their neighbors on Maple Ridge Drive, they were the picture of quiet success. A young couple who had found their place in a city that welcomed ambition wrapped in humility. Their evening routine was just as predictable. Elena would return home around 7 p.m., usually carrying takeout from whatever restaurant had caught her attention during her commute. David would already be at his computer, finishing up work or reviewing code that couldn't wait until morning. They would eat dinner together on the couch, sharing stories about difficult patients and impossible deadlines, their conversation flowing with the comfortable rhythm of 2 people who had learned to navigate life as a team. On weekends, they explored San Antonio's endless supply of food trucks and farmers markets, Elena documenting their adventures with the enthusiasm of someone who had never quite gotten used to the abundance of choices America offered. But beneath the surface of their carefully constructed normalcy, Elena Vasquez was drowning in a sea of financial obligations that David knew nothing about. The credit card statements that arrived monthly were intercepted before he could see them. The phone calls from collection agencies were answered with promises she had no intention of keeping. The second mortgage she had secretly taken out on her deceased aunt's property in Corpus Christi was 3 months behind, and the foreclosure notices were piling up in a drawer she kept locked in her home office. Elena had mastered the art of compartmentalization, presenting David with only the version of their life that felt manageable while wrestling privately with debts that had spiraled beyond her control. The pressure had been building for months when Elena told David she needed to drive to Austin to help her cousin Maria with some family emergency. It was a Tuesday evening in late September, the kind of humid Texas night that made even sitting still feel like work. Elena packed lightly, just an overnight bag and her phone charger. She kissed David goodbye at the front door, promising to call when she arrived safely. He watched her BMW disappear around the corner, the taillights fading into the suburban darkness, completely unaware that he would never see his wife alive again. Or so he thought. Elena's phone went straight to voicemail when David tried calling her at 10 p.m. By midnight, he was pacing their living room, checking the news for reports of accidents on I-35. When Maria finally answered her phone at 1 a.m., confused and groggy, she had no idea what David was talking about. No family emergency. No expected visit from Elena. No communication at all. David's worry transformed into something sharper, more urgent. He called every hospital between San Antonio and Austin, spoke to 3 different police dispatchers, and spent the rest of the night refreshing traffic accident databases online. The next morning, David filed a missing person report with the San Antonio Police Department. Detective Carlos Mendez, a 15-year veteran who had handled hundreds of similar cases, took the information with professional sympathy but little sense of urgency. Adults disappeared for all kinds of reasons, he explained gently. Marital problems, financial stress, personal crises that required space and time to resolve. Most came home within 48 hours with explanations that ranged from embarrassing to heartbreaking. David insisted this was different. Elena wouldn't just vanish without a word. They had no serious problems, no secrets, no reason for her to run. Detective Mendez nodded politely and assured David they would do everything possible to locate his wife. 2 days later, at 6:47 a.m., a jogger called 911 to report smoke rising from a wooded area off Highway 16, about 20 miles southeast of San Antonio. The Behar County Fire Department responded to what they assumed would be a routine brush fire, but what they found instead would haunt the first responders for years to come. Elena's BMW sat at the center of a small clearing, completely engulfed in flames that had been burning for hours. The interior was a molten mess of twisted metal and melted plastic, but the license plate was still partially visible, and the VIN number confirmed what David had been dreading. This was his wife's car. The body inside was burned beyond recognition, reduced to little more than charred bone fragments and ash. The medical examiner's team worked meticulously to recover what remained, but the intense heat had destroyed most biological evidence. DNA testing would be nearly impossible with such degraded samples. However, tucked under the driver's seat, partially protected by the metal frame, investigators found Elena's hospital ID badge, warped by heat but still identifiable. More conclusively, dental records obtained from Elena's dentist provided a positive match with the teeth recovered from the scene. Dr. Patricia Hawkins, the county's chief medical examiner, signed off on the identification with the clinical detachment that years of similar cases had taught her to maintain. Detective Mendez delivered the news to David at his workplace, pulling him into a conference room where the fluorescent lights seemed too bright for such a dark conversation. David listened without interruption as Mendez explained what they had found, how they had confirmed Elena's identity, and why the case would likely be classified as an accidental death pending further investigation. There were no signs of foul play, no evidence of another vehicle involved, no indication that Elena had been forced off the road. Sometimes, Mendez said quietly, people just lost control. Maybe she fell asleep at the wheel. Maybe she swerved to avoid an animal. Maybe she had been dealing with something that impaired her judgment. They might never know for certain, but the outcome was tragically clear. David Kim sat in the funeral home's consultation room, staring at casket catalogs. He couldn't focus on reading. The funeral director, a soft-spoken man named Robert Martinez, had guided hundreds of grieving families through these same decisions. But David's hollow-eyed silence was more unsettling than the usual tears and desperate questions. When asked about viewing arrangements, David's response was immediate and non-negotiable. The casket would remain closed. No one needed to see what 5 hours of intense fire had done to the woman he loved. Some memories were meant to be preserved, not destroyed by reality. The service was held at St. Matthew's Catholic Church on a gray October morning that seemed designed for mourning. Elena's co-workers from Methodist Hospital filled 3 entire pews, many of them still struggling to understand how their vibrant colleague had simply vanished from their lives. David's parents flew in from Seattle, his mother clutching a photo of Elena from their wedding day, as if it might somehow bring her back. Elena's family made the drive from various Texas cities, her sister Carmen delivering a eulogy that painted Elena as the family dreamer, the one who had always believed America would give her everything she worked for. What none of the mourners knew was that Elena's financial troubles had been far worse than David had discovered even after her death. While sorting through her personal effects, he had found the locked drawer in her home office, forced it open with a screwdriver, and discovered a nightmare of unpaid bills and legal notices. Credit card debt totaling $127,000 across 8 different accounts. A second mortgage on inherited property that was already in foreclosure proceedings. Medical bills from treatments she had never mentioned, including expensive fertility consultations that suggested she had been trying to get pregnant without telling him. The Elena he thought he knew had been carefully curated, edited to hide a woman drowning in obligations she couldn't meet. The insurance settlement came through faster than David expected. Elena's life insurance policy, purchased through the hospital's group plan, paid out $180,000 with minimal investigation. The claims adjuster, Janet Wu, had seen enough accidental deaths to recognize the pattern. Young person, tragic circumstances, clear cause of death, no red flags in the application history. She processed the paperwork with routine efficiency, expressing sympathy while explaining that the funds would be available within 10 business days. David signed the forms mechanically, unable to shake the feeling that he was profiting from Elena's secrets rather than her love. He used the money deliberately, almost ritualistically. First, he paid off Elena's hidden debts, working through the collection agencies and credit card companies with the grim satisfaction of someone cleaning up a mess they hadn't made. The foreclosure on the Corpus Christi property was halted with a cashier's check that cleared the arrears and penalties. He donated her medical equipment and uniforms to a nursing school scholarship fund, keeping only her hospital ID badge and a few photographs. What remained of the insurance money was deposited into a savings account he rarely checked, earning interest he didn't want and growing into a sum that felt more like evidence than inheritance. The house on Maple Ridge Drive became unbearable within weeks of the funeral. Every room held conversations they would never finish, plans they would never execute, routines that now served no purpose. David found himself avoiding the kitchen where Elena used to stand every morning, drinking coffee and checking her phone while mentally preparing for another day of caring for other people. The living room couch where they had shared countless takeout dinners felt like a museum display of a life that had ended too abruptly. When his lease renewal notice arrived in December, David barely read it before deciding to move. His company's Denver office had been trying to recruit experienced developers for months, offering relocation packages and significant salary increases to anyone willing to leave Texas's competitive tech market. David accepted the transfer with the same hollow determination he had brought to settling Elena's affairs. Colorado represented the possibility of anonymity, of starting over in a place where no one would ask careful questions about his wife or offer sympathy he didn't want to accept. The move was scheduled for early January, giving him enough time to pack up 5 years of shared memories into boxes that would either be shipped north or donated to strangers. Christmas came and went without celebration. David spent the holiday deleting Elena's social media accounts and canceling subscriptions she had accumulated, streaming services, magazine deliveries, gym memberships that would have continued charging fees indefinitely if left unattended. Each cancellation required explaining that the account holder was deceased, providing death certificate numbers to customer service representatives who responded with scripted condolences and efficient account closures. By New Year's Eve, Elena's digital footprint had been systematically erased, leaving David as the sole keeper of memories that felt increasingly surreal. But late at night, when the house was quiet and his mind was too exhausted to maintain its careful defenses, David found himself returning to questions that had no satisfying answers. Elena's car had been found 20 miles from the route she should have taken to Austin. The fire had burned hot enough to destroy most evidence, but cool enough to leave her ID badge partially intact. She had been carrying no luggage despite claiming she was planning to stay overnight with family. The cousin Maria had seemed genuinely confused about any family emergency, suggesting Elena had fabricated the entire reason for her trip. These inconsistencies felt like puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit together, creating a picture that was almost but not entirely complete. Detective Mendez had assured David that accidental deaths often involve inconsistencies that seemed suspicious to grieving family members, but were actually quite common. People changed routes for reasons they never explained. They stopped for gas or food without planning to. They dealt with personal crises in ways that surprised even their closest relatives. The detective's explanations were logical and compassionate, but they didn't address the deeper question David couldn't articulate. Why had Elena felt the need to lie about where she was going on what would become the last night of her life? The Denver job started in February, and David threw himself into debugging code with the intensity of someone trying to solve problems that actually had solutions. His new apartment was functional and impersonal, furnished with items chosen for efficiency rather than comfort. He avoided forming relationships with coworkers, declining invitations to happy hours and weekend gatherings with polite explanations about still adjusting to the move. Colorado's mountains and crisp air were supposed to represent healing, but David found himself thinking more about Elena in Denver than he had in San Antonio, as if distance had somehow amplified rather than diminished her presence in his daily thoughts. It was almost 18 months later when Elena's sister Carmen called with news that would shatter David's carefully constructed new beginning. She had been scrolling through Instagram, she explained, looking at photos from a friend's birthday party in Phoenix, when she saw a face that stopped her cold. A woman in the background of a group photo, laughing at something outside the camera frame, wearing a casual sundress, and looking relaxed in a way Elena rarely had during her final months in San Antonio. Carmen had stared at the image for minutes, zooming in and out, trying to convince herself she was seeing things that weren't there. But the resemblance was unmistakable. The same high cheekbones, the same slightly crooked smile, the same small scar on her left temple from a childhood accident. The woman in the photo looked exactly like Elena Vasquez, except Elena Vasquez had been dead for 2 years. David stared at the screenshot Carmen had sent him, his laptop screen illuminating his Denver apartment in cold blue light. The woman in the Instagram photo was standing near a punch bowl at what looked like a birthday party, caught mid-laugh in conversation with someone outside the frame. Her hair was shorter now, lighter, but the face was unmistakably familiar. The small scar above her left eyebrow, earned during a childhood fall from her bike, was clearly visible. The way she tilted her head when she smiled, the distinctive shape of her eyes, it was Elena, or someone who shared her exact features. Carmen had already done preliminary research, following digital breadcrumbs with the determination of someone who refused to accept impossible coincidences. The Instagram account belonged to someone named Sofia Martinez, a registered nurse working at St. Joseph's Hospital in Phoenix. Her posts were sparse but consistent. Photos from hiking trails around Arizona, pictures of coworkers at hospital functions, casual shots from coffee shops and farmers markets. Nothing about a past life in Texas. No mentions of a husband named David. No references to any identity before 2019. Sofia Martinez appeared to have materialized fully formed in Phoenix exactly 6 months after Elena Vasquez had supposedly died in that burning BMW. David spent 3 sleepless nights studying every image Carmen had found, cross-referencing locations and timestamps, looking for proof that would either confirm or destroy his growing suspicion. The woman calling herself Sofia had been careful to maintain a low profile, but social media left traces that were difficult to completely erase. She appeared in the background of other people's photos, tagged at restaurants and community events, always present but never central. Her employment at St. Joseph's was easily verified through the hospital staff directory, which listed her as a cardiac care specialist, the exact same specialty Elena had practiced in San Antonio. The coincidences were too numerous and too specific to ignore. Both women were registered nurses with cardiac specializations. Both had moved to new cities at suspicious times. Both maintained minimal social media presence despite being in healthcare professions that typically embrace networking. Most troubling, Sofia Martinez had no digital footprint prior to March 2019, as if she had simply materialized with a complete professional identity, but no personal history. David had been married to Elena long enough to recognize her habits and preferences reflected in Sofia's online activity. The same type of restaurants, the same hiking trails Elena had always talked about wanting to explore, even the same brand of coffee she had consumed religiously every morning. David contacted Marcus Webb, a private investigator recommended by a colleague who had used his services during a messy divorce. Webb specialized in background verification and missing persons cases, bringing 15 years of law enforcement experience to problems that required discretion and patience. When David explained the situation, Webb listened without interruption, taking notes in a small leather notebook that looked like it had survived decades of similar conversations. Webb's approach was methodical and unromantic. Gather evidence first, draw conclusions later, never assume anything until facts could be independently verified. Webb's initial research confirmed David's suspicions within 48 hours. Sofia Martinez's nursing license had been issued by the Arizona State Board of Nursing in February 2019, based on credentials transferred from an out-of-state application. Her employment history showed continuous work experience, but the references provided during her hiring process at St. Joseph's were difficult to verify. Previous employers claimed no records matching her employment dates, and contact numbers led to disconnected phone lines or businesses that had closed. Her apartment lease in Phoenix had been signed with cash payments and minimal credit verification, suggesting someone with either poor credit history or strong motivation to avoid financial scrutiny. More significantly, Webb discovered that Sofia Martinez had been living with a man named Carlos Ruiz, a Phoenix resident with a criminal background involving document forgery and identity fraud. Ruiz worked sporadically in construction, but seemed to maintain a lifestyle that exceeded his documented income. He drove a newer pickup truck, paid rent on a 2-bedroom apartment, and frequently made cash purchases that suggested access to unreported revenue streams. Webb's contacts in Arizona law enforcement confirmed that Ruiz was suspected of operating a small-scale identity theft operation, though he had never been formally charged due to lack of concrete evidence. The breakthrough came when Webb hired a local operative to collect a DNA sample from Sofia Martinez's coffee cup after she finished her shift at St. Joseph's. The process required patience and careful timing, but healthcare workers maintained predictable routines that made surveillance relatively straightforward. Sofia stopped at the same Starbucks location 3 times per week, always ordering the same drink, always sitting at the same corner table to decompress after 12-hour shifts. The discarded cup was retrieved and sent to a private laboratory that specialized in paternity testing and forensic analysis. The results arrived 10 days later in a sealed envelope that Webb delivered personally to David's Denver apartment. The DNA profile extracted from the coffee cup matched genetic markers from hair samples David had provided from Elena's belongings. The probability of a false match was less than 1 in several billion, making the identification scientifically certain. Elena Vasquez, the woman David had buried and mourned and memorialized, was alive and working under an assumed identity in Phoenix, Arizona. Somewhere, another woman's remains lay in Elena's grave, and David had been living with a lie that had shaped every decision he had made for the past 5 years. David made the drive to Phoenix with web surveillance photos spread across his passenger seat, like evidence in a trial he was preparing to argue with himself. The 8-hour journey through desert landscapes gave him time to rehearse conversations he might never have, to imagine explanations that might make sense of 5 years of deception. But when he finally parked outside the modest apartment complex where Sofia Martinez lived her carefully constructed lie, David realized that no amount of preparation could have readied him for the possibility of seeing Elena alive. He waited in his rental car until 7:30 p.m., when web surveillance notes indicated she would return from her shift. The woman who emerged from the silver Honda Accord moved with Elena's familiar efficiency, but everything else about her had been altered with deliberate precision. Her hair was auburn now instead of black, cut short and styled differently. She wore contacts that changed her eye color from brown to hazel. Even her posture seemed modified, more confident and relaxed than the Elena he remembered, who had carried the weight of hidden debts in every step. David followed her into the apartment complex's courtyard, his heart hammering against his ribs as she fumbled with her keys at apartment 2B. When she turned around and saw him standing 15 feet away, her face went through a series of expressions that confirmed everything Webb's investigation had uncovered. First recognition, then shock, then something that looked almost like relief. "Hello, Elena," David said quietly. She didn't run. She didn't deny her identity. Instead, she set her purse down on the concrete step and looked at him with the same direct gaze she had used when they were married, when she was supposedly telling him the truth about her life. "How long have you known?" she asked. David had imagined this moment would involve screaming or crying or desperate explanations, but Elena's calm acceptance was somehow more unsettling than any emotional outburst would have been. She invited him into the apartment she shared with Carlos Ruiz, who was conveniently absent, and made coffee with the same methodical precision she had brought to every domestic task during their marriage. The living room was sparse but comfortable, furnished with items that suggested a couple living paycheck to paycheck rather than people running a sophisticated identity fraud operation. Elena's explanation came in measured sentences that sounded rehearsed, as if she had been preparing for this conversation for years. The financial pressure had become unbearable by September 2019, she said. The debts were mounting faster than she could manage them, and the foreclosure on her aunt's property was threatening to expose other lies she had been maintaining. Carlos had offered her a way out, not just from the debts, but from the life that had been suffocating her for months. The plan had required a substitute, someone whose disappearance wouldn't immediately trigger a missing person investigation. The woman whose body had been found in Elena's car was named Jennifer Walsh, a 34-year-old homeless woman who had been living in a tent encampment near downtown San Antonio. Carlos had approached her with an offer of temporary work, promising cash payment for what he described as a simple driving job. Jennifer had agreed to drive Elena's car to a remote location, where she was supposed to wait for further instructions. Instead, Carlos had killed her and staged the fire to destroy evidence, while creating the perfect cover for Elena's disappearance. Elena insisted she hadn't known about Carlos's plan to commit murder, claiming she had believed he would simply abandon Jennifer somewhere safe after staging an empty car fire. But the details of her new identity had been prepared too thoroughly. Her transition to Sofia Martinez had been too seamless for David to believe she hadn't understood the full scope of what was being planned. She had been ready with forged nursing credentials, a fabricated work history, and a complete backstory that required months of preparation. The confrontation lasted 3 hours, with Elena alternating between apologies and justifications that revealed how completely she had rationalized her choices. She claimed she had never meant to hurt David, insisting that his insurance settlement had helped him start fresh in Denver. She said Jennifer Walsh had been dying anyway, living on the streets with untreated mental illness and substance abuse problems. She argued that everyone was better off now. David had moved on. She had found happiness with Carlos, and only Jennifer had really lost anything, and Jennifer's life had already been essentially over. David listened without interrupting, recognizing that Elena had become someone entirely different from the woman he had married. The guilt and desperation that had driven her to disappear had been replaced by a cold pragmatism that allowed her to sleep peacefully next to the man who had murdered an innocent stranger to facilitate her escape. When she finished explaining, David asked only one question. Did she ever think about Jennifer Walsh, about the family that might still be wondering what happened to their daughter or sister or mother? Elena's answer was immediate and chilling. People like Jennifer don't have families that look for them. That's why it worked. David left the apartment complex and drove directly to the Phoenix Police Department, where Detective Lisa Chun took his statement with the professional skepticism that 5 years of experience had taught her to apply to extraordinary claims. But the evidence Webb had gathered was substantial enough to warrant immediate investigation, and Elena's confession to David had been recorded on his phone without her knowledge. Within 72 hours, both Elena Vasquez and Carlos Ruiz were in custody, facing charges that range from identity theft and insurance fraud to first-degree murder. The trial began 8 months later in a Phoenix courtroom that drew national media attention. Elena Vasquez, now back to using her real name, sat beside her court-appointed attorney, wearing the same composed expression she had maintained since her arrest. Carlos Ruiz, facing first-degree murder charges, had hired a private defense team that argued he had been manipulated by a desperate woman who had promised him money and affection in exchange for helping her disappear. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Maria Santos, methodically dismantled both defendants' attempts to shift blame. Elena's recorded confession to David became crucial evidence, particularly her admission that people like Jennifer Walsh don't have families that look for them. Phone records showed extensive communication between Elena and Carlos in the weeks before her supposed death, including deleted text messages that forensic specialists had partially recovered. The messages discussed timing, logistics, and contingency plans with the clinical precision of people planning a business transaction rather than an improvised escape. Jennifer Walsh was finally identified through DNA analysis that matched her to a missing person report filed in Oklahoma 3 years earlier. Her real name was Jennifer Marie Walsh, and she had been a former nursing assistant who had struggled with addiction and mental health issues after losing her job and apartment. Her sister, Patricia Walsh, traveled from Tulsa to testify about Jennifer's disappearance and the family's unsuccessful attempts to locate her through homeless services and police departments across the Southwest. Patricia's victim impact statement, delivered through tears but with unwavering strength, reminded the court that Jennifer had been someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone who had mattered to people who had never stopped looking for her. Elena's defense team attempted to argue diminished capacity, presenting evidence of her financial stress, and claiming she had been coerced by Carlos into participating in a plan she hadn't fully understood. But the prosecution countered with evidence of Elena's methodical preparation for her new identity, including nursing license applications submitted weeks before her disappearance and apartment deposits paid using Jennifer Walsh's identification documents. The jury deliberated for 6 days before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges against both defendants. Carlos Ruiz was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole for first-degree murder, plus an additional 25 years for conspiracy, identity theft, and fraud. Elena received 25 years to life for conspiracy to commit murder, with eligibility for parole after serving 18 years. Judge Robert Harrison, delivering Elena's sentence, noted that her crime was particularly heinous because it had required her to view another human being as disposable, chosen specifically because she was vulnerable and unlikely to be missed. David attended every day of the trial, sitting in the gallery behind the prosecution table, forcing himself to witness the complete destruction of a life he had thought he shared with Elena. The woman he had married, the woman he had grieved, had never actually existed. Elena Vasquez had been a carefully curated performance, hiding debts and desperation behind a facade of domestic contentment. The real Elena was someone capable of watching an innocent woman die to facilitate her own selfish escape. The insurance company sought restitution of the $180,000 settlement, but David's attorney successfully argued that he had received the funds in good faith based on law enforcement confirmation of Elena's death. David ultimately reached a voluntary settlement agreement, returning $100,000 to the insurance company while keeping the remainder to establish a memorial fund in Jennifer Walsh's name. The fund provides resources for homeless individuals struggling with mental health and addiction issues, particularly women who are at risk of exploitation. David returned to Denver and slowly began the process of rebuilding his life on a foundation of truth rather than lies. He entered therapy to process the trauma of learning that his marriage had been built on deception and his grief had been based on fiction. It took 2 years before he could trust his own judgment enough to form new relationships, but he eventually found peace in accepting that some betrayals are so complete they can only be survived, never fully understood. Elena Vasquez remains incarcerated at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Perryville, where she works in the medical unit treating inmates with chronic conditions. She has never expressed remorse for Jennifer Walsh's death, maintaining that she was a victim of Carlos's manipulation rather than an active participant in murder. Carlos Ruiz died in prison in 2024 after being attacked by another inmate who had learned about his crimes against homeless women. The case became a textbook study in identity fraud and the vulnerability of society's most marginalized individuals. Jennifer Walsh's grave in San Antonio was moved to a proper cemetery, with a headstone bearing her real name and the dates of her actual life rather than Elena's stolen identity. Her sister Patricia visits twice a year, bringing flowers and spending time with a woman who had been lost long before she was murdered. For David Kim, the lesson was simple but devastating. Sometimes the person sharing your bed, your meals, your dreams for the future is a complete stranger wearing the mask of someone you love. The real tragedy wasn't just that Elena had died to him 5 years before he learned she was alive. It was that the Elena he had fallen in love with had never existed at all.